Hi, everyone. We are back for another exciting words and music session. I'm so happy to welcome you all to Crossroads, Intersections of History and Creative Writing, which I feel like continues a really cool thread we've got going through this event. We've talked about history in graphic novel form. We've talked about currently and formerly incarcerated people learning how to do historical research and filling in gaps where there were silences. This morning, we talked about cocktail history research and how she had to go through the archives to find the history of a cocktail and some myth busting she did along the way. And now we're going to talk about how creative writers use real historical facts in their work. I'm so excited to introduce the moderator for this session, Christopher Louis Romaguera. He is a Cuban-American writer who lives in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was born in Halle, Florida, and graduated from Florida International University in Miami. He has an MFA in creative writing from the University of New Orleans. He has been published in New Orleans Review, Prank Magazine, Louisiana Literature, Santa Fe Writers Project, Catapult, Massachusetts Review, and others. He's a monthly columnist at the Plowshares blog and is the poetry editor for the Podunk Review. Romaguera was an editorial intern at Electric Literature, and he is a VONA alum. And on a personal note, is one of the most generous, warm-hearted human beings you will ever meet. And Words and Music is so proud to call him one of our people. Christopher Louis Romaguera, take it away.
Megan, you didn't tell me you were going to make me blush right before introducing me. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm really excited to be here with the panelists who are amazing writers and amazing people. And I'm really proud to be here for Words and Music and One Book, One New Orleans. For our panel today, we will have Eric Nguyen. Eric Nguyen earned an MFA in creative writing from McNeese State University in Louisiana. He's been awarded fellowships from Lambda Literary, Voices of Our Nation Arts, VONA, and the Tin House Workshop. He's the editor-in-chief of Diacritics. He lives in Washington, D.C., and Things We Lost to the Water is his first novel and the last thing I have read. Brenda Marie Osbey's 7 books include All Souls Essential Poems from LSU Press, History and Other Poems from Time Being, and the limited edition chapbook 1967. She is the author also of Congo New Orleans opera triptych, including Sultan au Grand Marie. My apologies if I mispronounced that. Critical studies of her work include Summoning Our Saints, the poetry and prose of Brenda Marie Osbey by John Warden Lowe. She is the recipient of numerous writing and research fellowships and awards, and she's currently the 2021-2022 Hudson Trust John Carter Brown Library Fellow. And lastly, but not least, we also have Elizabeth Miki Brina, who is the author of Speak Okinawa. Her work has appeared in The Sun, River Thief, Lit Hub, and Gulf Coast Magazine, among others. She is the recipient of a Rona Jaff Breadloaf Scholarship and a New York Stage Summer Writers Institute Scholarship. She currently lives and teaches in New Orleans. And I just want to thank you all for being here with me. And I'm really excited for this discussion. And I hope when I'm taking notes, when you all are informing me, it's not too annoying. So this panel, which is titled Crosswords, the Intersections of History and Creative Writing, I think is really interesting because we have panelists from 3 different genres in fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction. Not that they don't write other things, but we have people who publish in 3 different genres who all have works really embedded in history and in facts. And so seeing this, seeing how they intersect as someone who writes in multiple genres and someone who writes a lot diasporically is very interesting to me. To start this, I wanted to ask what everyone's research method was when they're starting a creative project. Do they know what they want to tackle and look up things for a particular story? Do you all go, just kind of researching and something sparks? I'm very curious about how the research method starts for y'all. And also, I'm so sorry. I want to apologize. We also would like to have, if you all don't mind, reading a little bit to start. I do apologize for that. Read a little bit to start, and I think we were starting with Liz. Did you want?
Yeah. So, thank you, Christopher.
Yeah.
And thank you, Words and Music, for hosting. I'm reading from my book, Speak Okinawa. It's called Speak Okinawa because Okinawa is where my mother was born and raised. And she lived there until she met my father, who was a U.S. soldier stationed on the island um, right after he fought in Vietnam. And a lot of people don't know anything about Okinawa. I didn't know anything about Okinawa until I started writing this book. So, what most people know is that it was the site of the Battle of Okinawa. But we usually hear about it from the American perspective and how it was such a brutal war, a brutal battle, and had so brutal that it was one of the rationalizations, false rationalizations for dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But from the Okinawans' perspective, it was complete and total devastation of the island. It was completely crushed and burned from the bombing, and 140,000 Okinawans were killed, which was about 1/3 of the population, and almost all civilians, and the rest were left homeless. And since then, the U.S. military has militarized and occupied the island. And that is the background of the excerpt that I'm reading, but also how my parents met. And I am reading from a chapter that is told from the point of view of women who met and married U.S. soldiers. Okay. We are done with this war, but they're not. They have a war to fight in Korea and then a war to fight in Vietnam. As long as communism is a threat, Vice President Richard Nixon announces during his visit in 1953, the United States will hold Okinawa. They must use our land to build a fortress to protect the free world, a world in which we are not included. They must use our land to launch ships that carry tanks and guns, to launch planes that drop bombs. We shudder with each sound as ship after ship departs, as plane after plane takes off, remembering the damage and devastation, the slaughter those ships and planes have caused. They must use our land to store missiles and poisonous gases. We feel guilty, complicit, even though we have no choice. Forests and fields that have just begun to heal are bulldozed and replaced with concrete. Farms that once grew pineapple and sugarcane are bulldozed and replaced with concrete. Family-owned plots that have been passed down for generations are confiscated, often at gunpoint, and residents are evicted. Homes are bulldozed and burned and replaced with concrete. What becomes known as the Bayonets and Bulldozers campaign, over 50,000 of us lose titles to our land. In 1956, as part of mass demonstrations and protests as part of our all-island land struggle, 100,000 of us assemble at their headquarters in Naha, and they agree to pay us for the land they already stole. But it is not enough, not nearly enough. So we become labor. We are hired to build bases. We are hired to build barracks, armories, loading docks, landing strips, fences, gates, more roads. We are hired to serve food in their cafeterias and clean their houses. The prettiest of us, those who have curves and speak the best English, get to work at the post office and fancy restaurants like McDonald's. Cities form around these bases with bright neon signs in English, advertising to them, welcoming them, with bars and clubs where soldiers can yell and laugh, fight and flirt, and spend money like it's their last day on earth because, well, who knows? Their last day could be very soon. They are fighting a war and they pay us to help them forget. But we remember. We will always remember. Some of us fall in love with them. Is that so strange? Because they are tall and strong and polite, taller and stronger and more polite than many of our men, since most of our men are gone. Because they carry heavy bags and boxes for us. They open doors for us and let us enter or exit in front of them. They pull out chairs for us. They offer us their seats and stand for us. Because they drive us home in their cars and trucks so we don't have to walk home by ourselves at night. Because they are rich. They make more in a day than we make in a month. They smell like soap when we can only rinse our faces and armpits with water from buckets or soak in a public bathhouse once a week. They leave us big tips and buy us gifts, perfume, makeup, silk stockings, chocolate, chewing gum, bottles of liquor, and cartons of cigarettes that they bring from their bases and we sell to each other for cheaper than we can get anywhere else on the island. Because they let us watch movies on their televisions and wash clothes in their washing machines so we don't have to wash clothes in the river. Because sometimes they buy us our own televisions and washing machines, sometimes they pay our rent. Because some of them are gentle and genuine, warm and kind, foolish and impetuous, and very young, just like us. Some of them fall in love with us. Is that so bad? Because we are tiny and shy and vulnerable, tinier and shyer and more vulnerable than many of their women who are far, far away. Because we blush and we giggle, we lower our heads and avert our eyes. We don't speak much English, so they can't understand us. They don't know us. So they look at our faces and imagine who we are, see who they want to see. They look at our faces and see themselves as they want to be seen. We can't understand them either. We don't know them either. So we imagine that they are brave and good, will protect us and take care of us, never hurt us. Because we are grateful for everything they do for us. We are not angry, not like those of us who are older, not like the men who hate them because they are taller and stronger and richer. We are not used to men approaching us and treating us like beautiful, delicate creatures meant to be cherished. We are not used to men lying to us in such a way that we have to believe them, lying to us in such a way that they have to believe themselves. Don't confuse sympathy for love, one of their mothers writes back to one of them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Liz. I like Coretta. I remember first time reading your work and first time hearing you read your work, and it was so impactful. And then being able to read the memoir itself. For our next reader, Eric, would you mind sharing a little something with us?
Sure. So my book is Things We Lost to the Water. It's a novel, and I don't think there's any intro needed. It's just the beginning of the book. So I'll just start there. It's August 1979. New Orleans is at war. The long howl in the sky. What else can it mean? Hoong drops the dishes into the sink and grabs the baby before he starts crying. She begins running toward the door, but then she remembers. This time, another son. She forgets his name temporarily. The howl is so loud. What's important is to find him. Is he under the bed? No, he is not under the bed. Is he hiding in the closet? No, he is not in the closet. Is he in the bathroom then? Behind the plastic curtains, sitting scared in the tub. He is not in the bathroom. Behind the plastic curtains, sitting scared in the tub. And as she turns around, he's at the door, holding on to the frame, his eyes watering, his cheeks red. "Ma'am," he cries, "Mom." The word reminds Hoong of everything she needs to know. In the next moment, she grabs his hands and pulls him toward her chest. With this precious cargo, these two sons, she darts across the apartment, an arrow flying away from its bow, a bullet away from its gun. She's racing toward the door and leaping down the steps, but she can't move fast enough. The air is like water. It's like running through water, through an ocean. She feels the wetness on her legs, the water rising. In the sky, the early evening sky, with a spotting of stars already, is streaked red and orange, like a fire, like an explosion suspended mid-air. In that moment, before the crush, the shattering, the death she's always imagined, till someone yells, "Stop." Someone tells her to stop. And just like that, the sirens hush. The silence is violent. It slices. It cuts. "Hurricane alarm," Diane says. The old woman drops her cigarette. Just a hurricane alarm. A test. Nothing to be afraid of. She reaches over and cups Hoong's cheek. "What do you mean?" Hoong asks. "A test. They're just doing a test. In case something happens." Diane says, "Go home now, Gung. Go home. Get some rest. It's getting late." Home. Late. Getting. There, late. Who understands? Maybe she does not. 1,000 thoughts are still settling in her mind. Where were the sounds from before? Not the alarm, but the grating calls of the grackles in the trees, the whistling breeze, the car speeding past. Where are they now? She notices Dum at the gates. Her eyes light up. Dum ai, she calls. Dum holds onto the bars of the gate and watches three boys riding past on bicycles. One stands on pedals, another rides without hands, but only for a second before grabbing, in a panic motion, the handlebars. A younger one tries to keep up on training wheels. Three boys, three brothers. Dum ai, Boone calls again. Dum waves as the boys ride leisurely past. When they're gone, he returns, and Hoon feels a mixture of pure happiness, comfort, and relief. Up the dirt road, a mother and her sons, hand in hand. And that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You wrote a really beautiful novel, and I really love that opening. Um, Next, can we hear a little something from you, Brenda Marie, please?
Opening portion of the poem History, the title poem for History and Other Poems. It begins with an epigraph. But I am tired today of history, its patinaed cliches of endless evil, from The Islands by Robert Hayden. And so we begin again our wearied and wearying lessons because we have not learned them well enough. Only this time without chanties about some ocean blue, because for us, all oceans are forever red. And we begin this time without the head and finger count, for what's the real measure of human loss once figures climb into the tens of thousands, multiplied by however many ships debarking from however many nations to archipelagos of death, to continents of doom. And still for all that chatter, Goree persisting into the red and golden sun, its few hundred or so inhabitants making the daily ferry run, barely even eyeing the western borne on across unroiling waters. And boys are playing at games innocent as all of time. Time and even more time is what has dullened us so, for we are tired of lessons, and yet it is to lessons we must go. The looming sea is all around the wide, wide world, and it is wide. Oh, yes, it is. The world is wide and full of evil ides, and the history of the world, if we would tell it, would strike us all down dead upon the spot marked with its greenish stain like money in the pokerman's upturned pot. In Bambara and Shango, Wolof and Pul, Chihiba, Twi, Ewondo, in Sara and Sarera, in Tupuri, Hausa, Mandar Bulu, in Yoruba, Kinyarwanda, and Kikongo, and all the languages around the hardy Cape then, let us tongue and tongue as the aperture of the hardiest of the old line trumpeters, and this time let us try for once to get it right, and this time let us tongue it deep and well into the night. Decreed that Greater Benin will export no more menaced chattels, for to continue in that way should only weaken the core of our kingdom. Women and children remain free, however, to be enslaved at any time, and kingdom come indeed. See also Senegambia, Liberia, Kingdom of Congo, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Ivory Coast, Bight of Biafra, Bight of Benin, southeast of Africa from Good Hope to Delgado, and all of Madagascar. Why is it called Cape of Good Hope? Sugar, cotton, metals, tobacco, shipping, finance, insurance, industry. Such cities as Amsterdam, Liverpool, Bristol, Stade and Land, Whitehaven, La Rochelle, and Boston, Rotterdam, Newport, Nantes, Lisbon, such kingdoms as fill in the blank, and all along North Africa herself, Indian Ocean, and so-called Middle East, Sahara of shifting footprints. Why is it called, do you believe, Cape of Good Hope, and then, of course, that red sea. Worlds, continents of exclusion, la trahison des clercs, the disironic unwillingness of colonial powers to self-destruct, mercantile movable property, chattel, rest, tyrannies of words thrown ad lib against the abject body. There is no history of this world that is not written in black.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful, and I hope I sound half as cool when I read as you do, Brenda Marie. Thank you. um, yeah, I think I would love to get the questions going. I will say, for anyone out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them, drop a line, and we'll make some time for Q&A at the end. And thank you so much for our writers for reading a little bit of your work. I really appreciate getting to hear y'all. To start, I was curious, how do you all start researching for a project? I was curious, like, what your methods were. How does it, how do you go into it? Do you start writing first and then research to confirm? Do you research first and then wait for like lines to come up? How does it go for y'all?
I'll go first. I think for me, at least for this first novel, I felt like comfortable to start writing it before doing much research. So I guess I kind of write first a little bit, but I feel like I had to research before I dig any deeper. So I guess my first avenue towards research is like books. I feel books are a great way to research because like they're written about the past, and it's something that I really can't go back to. Like part of Vietnamese American history is the Fall of Saigon, which takes place in 1975, which is way before I was born. So having history books were really important for my writing, but not just any history book. I felt like as a writer of color, I had to go to history books, narratives written by other writers of color, other Vietnamese American writers. So I read a lot of like memoirs, oral histories. I think those give me like a side of history that you don't see because history is always written by like the victors, people who are in power. So like those type of books, which I feel like sometimes are really rare because people who don't have power usually are not given the privilege to tell stories. So books are always a good avenue. I can also talk about just interviewing people, but that might be different questions because, again, sometimes the history of people of color are not written down and have to listen to elders, people who have experienced that part of history before.
I'll go. I think I started to write first. I mean, I had I had this question of why did my parents meet? Like, how did they meet? What happened in history that brought them together? As I came to realize that it wasn't just a coincidence and this isolated incident, and I started to write about it and realized that okay, I need to go back very far, and to really understand it and to make sense of it. So I mean, I think that's I wanted to just build a foundation that and I there's this one book. It was very hard to find Okinawan history books actually that weren't just about the battle and about military strategies, and which was very very frustrating and also and sad. But I did come across one book that was like 500 pages of prehistoric Okinawa, to the battle. And that was, I didn't know how much of it I was going to use, right? But hardly any. But maybe I got a few pages out of it, but it was still so important to get that foundation of, just as much as I could possibly know to understand the all these events, the more recent events in context. And yeah, I agree. It's hard to find histories, these histories written from their point of view, and that was something I was really struggling to find too, especially because most of it's written in Japanese. So I was trying to find things that are written in English and translated in English. But I read a lot of memoirs and memoirs from of survivors of the battle, and also a lot of short stories and novellas, like anything I could get my hands on that was written by Okinawans about Okinawa, that was actually translated in English, um, and of course the interviews too. But I asked my parents a lot of questions. I tried to ask my mother's family questions through her, but I noticed that it's a lot of not just resistance of talking about it because it's so painful, but it's it's a learned skill to be able to think about and explain your life narratively. And if you didn't learn it and you weren't taught it, it's really, really difficult to put all. And I take that for granted, just to be able to put these events in order and shape it. So it was, yeah, it was a journey.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I think I kind of do both ways, because I think what I've mostly said is that I've come to history through writing, but I think now I have enough enough of my own writing history under me that I think I can now say that I came to writing through history. So I don't necessarily start with a topic, um, but I often start with one of two things: either something overheard that sparks a series of questions, or a question itself. And I've always worked with documents, historical documents, archival materials, photographs, because for me, the thing that's important is the telling, not so much what's being told as the nature of the telling, the nature of the narrative nature of what's happening. So it's very interesting to me to listen to Eric framing this story for us, where just like the mother, we're positioned to expect catastrophe. Um, and then what made me very happy inside that reading was the Dick and Jane children's readers version of this is a boy who's doing this. This is not a boy who's doing this. This is a girl who's doing that sort of back and forth kind of creation of innocence in a situation that at least appears to be menacing at the moment, whether it is or not, but that we, as the listening and reading audience, feel that menace. And then we also feel the relief when we see the boys playing, doing ordinary children, activities. Um, and then to listen to Liz talk about the difficulties of getting to the narrative, of getting people, not just getting people to tell, but going through, having the narrative mediated by someone who is a kind of almost a mediating vessel in the form of your mother. And then to talk about how that narrative framing is a learned behavior, that's something that is learned and taught in certain places and not learned and taught in other places. So it's interesting to me to hear that. It's valuable and sort of plotting in my mind what I can do with both of these two new forms of knowledge. But I think I think the short answer is, is that what you want? The short answer is that the process is always going on. It's always the process is always there, and all of that counts to me as research.
Yeah. No, yeah, no, I really appreciate hearing this because, like, I love the different perspectives and the different avenues of tackling. And in a lot of ways, I am always trying to figure out the question you just asked, Brenda Marie, of like how to, the telling is so important. So how to, get that information and tell it in the most effective way, which is, you know, which is kind of my next question because, Liz, you were talking about reading prehistoric, Okinawan history, and I'm trying to figure out how do you all go about weaving in all this historical background information, oral histories, interviews, telling a story narratively into poetry, a memoir, novel.
I like that question. I like that question. When you sent that question to us, things started clicking for me because I like I come from a family of people who who did all kinds of needlework. And so, of course, the imagery of weaving, and it's a standard thing that we use when we talk about history, isn't it? Or about any kind of narrative, is that kind of weaving and stuff. And yet, while I'm fascinated with that image, with that metaphor, I think that for what I'm doing, for instance, in a poem like History, is not so much that I'm choosing what to weave in. I'm looking at something that I see as a cloth. I see history. I see the history of the slave trade in this instance as a particular kind of cloth that we've been given. We've been given it in the shapes and figures of maps that we look at, in the shapes of how the narrative of the Americas is created in particular. And so very often what I'm doing is I'm looking at that cloth and doing the thing that needleworkers always say you can do, but they don't want you to do, and that's to turn the cloth over and look at the underside so that you see the knots and the potential errors and the things that are hidden, the things that are not supposed to be seen. And so what I'm looking for and listening for is what is in there that we aren't intentionally being told, that isn't intentionally on purpose being revealed to us. And sometimes just going through the documents, whether these are diaries or letters or reports, no matter what these documents are, they can be census records because there are censuses of enslavement and so forth. Those documents have a language, they have a narrative that they tell. Even things that are non language documents, pictorial things, they're narrative in nature and they have their own syntax. The law, for instance, as it's written, has its own syntax. And we are both told things through that language, through that syntax, through that representation for the public. And we're also denied access to certain knowledge. So, my model for that is Robert Hayden, who, by never allowing the enslaved Africans to speak in his poem Middle Passage,
Mm.
forces the enslavers and the traders to condemn themselves in our eyes and ears because we hear what's recorded in their logs and we hear them speak and pray and sing hymns as they're jettisoning cargo overboard, and that cargo is human beings. So all of that stuff is telling. And it's just a question of how much just as the recorders and the documenters decide how much to tell, I think as the authors we're also deciding what to tell, what to withhold, what to suggest, and it varies from work to work.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think for me, I guess it's not as, I don't think I can say it as poetically as Brenda Marie, but I think that what really spoke to me about what she's just said is that what to leave in and what to leave out. I think for me as a fiction writer, I kind of can, since it's a fictional narrative, I can kind of put in what I want and take out what I don't need. Like for me writing this, like it was important for me to get like the major historical moments right, like the fall of Saigon and
Mhm.
at the end Hurricane Katrina. But I feel like everything else in the middle, I can kind of put in what I wanted for that particular time and leave some stuff out. But also, I guess I had the freedom to make stuff up as well. I think for me, like that's what attracts me to fiction is like I can make stuff up, and I never promise, I guess, like to tell the truth in a way. But I feel like I I, I, I can make it up. But I feel like my goal as a writer is to lie in order to get to an emotional truth. And I think that I guess having that freedom to kind of bend the truth in a way, to kind of leave stuff out, put new things in, kind of gives me that freedom to work towards that truth that I want to explore, I want to talk about.
Yeah, a lie that makes a truth, so to speak,
Mhm,
right? Yeah.
Mhm.
mhm,
Yeah, that's that hits close to me too because I wouldn't say I had to make some stuff up, but I definitely a lot of I had to speculate a lot and fill in gaps, um, and that was part of how my process because it was told to me so in such a fragmented way, and I learned the history in such a fragmented way. It all all these different books, these very academic texts, sociological studies, plus the memoirs, which were the most important to me, but or the most what should I say useful or impactful to me. And even useful is the wrong word to choose, um, but yeah, I felt like I was almost like kind of like weaving, but I thought of it as curating. I was like, oh, okay, these details belong together here, and these details belong together here, and they're kind of all picked from different places. And then, but the connecting them or the sewing them together, right, was stuff that I added. The contributing to that, and I did have a lot of anxiety about doing that, and if I had a right to do that, but I wanted to be able to contain this story that I had not known for so long, this history that I had not known for so long, and that I, not that many people that I knew, but just to put it in one place, right, and make it a little bit more and make it accessible to me actually, and that is another problem too, right, with what do you leave out, what do you decide is not doesn't belong here in this place. So it's yeah, a lot of tough choices, right, and and another thing that was important to me too is I wanted to put it side by side, like present, past, present, past, present, past, because I go back and forth a lot in the memoir, or my life history, like personal history, collective history, personal history, collective history, just to show that they inform each other, and they can't exist without each other. And that we are constantly living in the past still, and the past lives in us. That's another way, I guess, that I try to weave in the research and history.
No, thank you all for that and for putting that so eloquently. I think it's something a lot of us as writers battle with, and it's always informative hearing everyone else's process on that. I feel like y'all have kind of touched on this already, about like the importance of this, but how do you all go about, especially when telling stories that have so often been erased or ignored? Like, how do you all go about knowing what to accentuate and keep in, and what you have to keep out of the story, or what has to be cut from the story?
That's the nice thing about poetry, I think, is that I'm a narrative poet, obviously. Um, I think that's one of the good things about poetry, is that um, in order to do poetry well, um, there has to be a kind of merciless cutting away. Um, and so it's always a story, no matter how long the poem is. And I've got now, two book length poems. No matter how long the poem is, there has to be this constant taking away, constant taking away, removing things that are either just taking up space. Those are obviously the easiest things to move, extra words, phrases, too much information. Um, but that process of subtraction is in itself a kind of for lack of a better term, a kind of distillation. And that's the thing that I think poetry does especially well. I think poetry and the essay do that especially well, is that distillation. That editing is something that you have to, self-editing is something that you have to learn, I think, very early on. And when I was a student, majoring in French and English at Tilton University, I had professors who were merciless subtractors. And would just, I would go in with a poem to sit with one of my professors, and I'd read the poem and he'd read the poem, and we'd go back and forth and go back and forth. And by the time I left the office, maybe 15 minutes later, maybe 3.5 hours later, I had maybe 6 lines left of a poem, and then I would go back, and then it was almost like I was trying to figure out, you know, that's amazing that you can be that merciless with text. What else can I get rid of? What else can I do? Can I turn this then into 2 lines or 3 lines, or what's left on the killing floor that can be scooped up and I don't want to say put into the sausage. What's left on the killing floor that can be scooped up and used in some other kind of way. But I love the taking away. I love the stripping away. And one of the things that I did was, how am I going to represent in the poem history? How am I going to represent the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from hundreds of places and hundreds and thousands of ethnic groups? How am I going to represent that? And one of the simplest ways to do it was through the names of languages. So when I go through those various lists of languages and so forth, that is both an illustration of the great breadth of the slave trade, and it also, I think, makes it very particular and precise, because it forces us to see not mere bodies as cargo, but actual, factual human beings.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think for me, like editing, like I feel like my first drafts are usually like just pouring everything like you can in there, um, like including like historical facts, and afterwards the next draft you kind of cut it out. Like I imagine like a block of marble, you cut everything out that is not necessary. And for me as a fiction writer, I think like like my first instinct is to put everything like that I feel is important there, but then as like a fiction and novels and short stories, and it's about an individual, a particular individual. You can't really speak to about a whole group of people. Otherwise, I mean, you can, but that'll be a very different novel than what I was working with. And I guess my editing process was asking like what parts of history are important to these characters, what parts of history do they carry with them. So like I found myself cutting out more stuff about like life in Vietnam, for example, like the everyday kind of stuff. The war scenes were not in particular important to my characters who were more civilians in the middle of a war. So like I had to cut out war scenes, for example. So I think for my editing process, it was trying to think about the individual characters and thinking about like again like what baggage they have and how do they use that baggage, how that baggage kind of weighs them down in a way, um, and how that kind of it's something that they carry, something that haunts them. So I think editing is really important, especially when you're including history, like in fiction, when it's a lot of times about a particular person, a particular made up person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's very similar to my process as well. But not, the characters are me and my parents. But right, like what parts of history are important to show, uh, like why they are the way that they are in this particular aspect. So it's really, yeah, uh, really, really difficult to decide what to keep and what to take away, and I can't help but feel like uh, I can't, because they're so precious to me, my parents and my family. Uh, I can't help but like I didn't, I didn't do them justice, but how is anyone supposed to do that? Because they're how do you capture like the entirety of all of their complications and complexities? And you just have to make choices of well, this is I'm just showing one aspect of it, right? And to me, what was important for this story was um, the how it came to be that my mother was so isolated, right? Like what happened in all of history that brought her to the United States and alone, right? And then what happened in history that made me like internalize so much racism and become so estranged from her, right? And it had to be only about that, and unfortunately it was it was very painful and sad. And that's something too that I worried about, is just like, why am I just like, why are we just focusing on the bad stuff? And I had to leave out a lot of good, I did, and I wish that I didn't have to, but it was becoming, it was kind of just a way I had to uh clean it. There's so much it's so messy, right? That I wanted to I wanted to kind of just put some order on it, and it had to be this order for this story, right? For this memoir. um so yeah, it's very, very, very similar. Just like what's important to the characters, like which are people, real people. But that's how I think of them, because I am making, I in a lot of ways I am making them characters. But it's so, yeah, that's really, that's tough. That's a tough thing to admit, right? But yeah, I had, that's just had to be done.
Can I just jump in here and say you did that beautifully, by the way, Liz. I really like the way you did that because what you're describing is a process of which story you're telling. In addition to your previously framing it for us by saying, this is my part and this is the family and this is me and then this is, and we go back and forth between those. But also you're saying that you're framing this particular narrative. And the reason that that speaks to me so is that that is exactly what recorders and writers of history do.
Mhm.
Recorders and writers of history say, we're telling a hero story about a great general who won a war. Lots of people died. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people died. But that's not the story we're telling. We're telling a story about how we saved the world from fill in the blank and created better opportunities for blah, 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 blah. But we have all of us been trained to think of history as fact. But
Mhm.
history is not fact. History is multiple authors, multiple editors, multiple tellers deciding what to include, what not to include, and how to frame the story that we're given. That's what I love about what you both are saying about choosing. Am I going to tell this lie in order to reveal this other truth? That's the very thing that history and historians have kept us all fed on for all of our lives. So I'm always saying, well, who says?
Mhm.
And why? And how do we know? Do we trust this person? Um, and it's interesting because Liz, in your memoir, you give us reason to trust you. You go back and forth with this narrative. You're looking at yourself almost as though you're looking from the outside. It's this insider outsider view that you share with us. And that's why we then trust you. Because we say, look, she's just like us. She doesn't know any of this stuff. She has to go digging for it. And then she distills it in a particular way and reveals it to us. And then we learn something not only about her parents, not only about Okinawa, not only about herself. We learn something about what matters and how stories get told. That's the thing that's really killer about it. And I'm just so hung up on this on the children's reader version of that opening passage that Eric read. It's driving me crazy because it reminds me of that portion in Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, where we're getting this storytelling. And there's every possible, if you want a story, there's every version of story, of narrative, of telling in the novels of Toni Morrison. She never runs out of ways to tell. And the fact that you key in on that innocence in that opening passage like that is really just, for lack of a better word, it's a killer way of framing the story. I love it. I love it. This is good stuff.
Thank you so much, Brenda Marie. That was amazing. That really, that helped me a lot. Yeah. With,
No, yeah, thank you all on that. Like, yeah, yeah, I'm like constantly trying not to be dumbfounded, so I keep asking questions. Y'all, I really appreciate y'all. I Brenda Marie, in your a beautiful response that you just said, you mentioned a couple of times trust, right? And I am going to, from now on, when people say anything to me, just say "who says," because I think that's appropriate in this world right now. But I think personally, as a writer, I think one of the most important things to do as a writer is to get the reader to trust you. And I feel like, this is in this world where, as you had just said, Brenda Marie, like, there's multiple tellers, and truth is having this moment where it's being even more blurred and buried depending on who you are, and especially as us all having the extra burden of being BIPOC writers and having to tell stories against a main narrative. I was curious, how do you all go about writing and tackling, having the readers trust you in this time when we also are having to write against these big narratives that have been told against our respective peoples?
I mean, I guess, I think about that a lot, and I think, just I I think because I trust the reader, I try to trust the reader with my, I try to make myself vulnerable and be like, uh, I like, me first. I did some really, really terrible things, and I used to think this, and I used to think this, and so trusting the reader with that they're not going to judge me, that they're not, that the reader is going to be open hearted and appreciate that, and then come back to me with their vulnerability too, is I guess so one way that I approach it.
I think
Yeah,
I'm never really the teller. I had a conversation about this with a friend of mine who teaches African American literature, and who was teaching something from History and Other Poems. I don't know which poem it was. And she was arguing back and forth with her students about the speaker in the poem. And the students were saying, but the speaker is Brenda Marie Osbey. That's who the speaker is. And so she finally, after going around this several times, she just puts her foot down and says, Brenda Marie Osbey has never been a slave. She is not a slave. So I and I thought it was hilarious when she told me that people are thinking that the I is Brenda Marie, so that I'm creating speakers, whether that speaker is a document, or whether that speaker is a person, an actual person speaking. Um, I'm the author, and so I control the show. I get to say what goes in and what goes out and so forth. Um, and the narrative is a narrative that I generate and author and direct. But I'm always conscious of the fact that I'm the person in charge. Um, for me, it's almost like being the director of a theatrical production rather than the author of it, or rather than being the actors. I'm not acting in anything. I'm creating something and putting it out there. And what I'm asking the reader is not so much to trust me, but to enter a particular kind of cultural, historical, social space, and see what happens from that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that.
as for me, I'm like, I guess as a fiction writer, like that idea of trust, like I don't know how I would get to it. I guess like I guess it's kind of a mixture of what Elizabeth and Brenda Marie said. Is like, on the one hand, it's kind of making my characters vulnerable to make them more human, which I feel like as a fiction writer, like I have more freedom to basically shape their lives. I don't have to. There's no real life to pull from.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think like I guess like I'm writing like realistic fiction. It's kind of I'm a conduit in a way for like the shared history of, I guess, my people, Vietnamese American. So I think that goes back to like researching and making sure I get, if not the factual parts right, at least like the emotional truth of people who have been through war, people who have been refugees, getting that core, that truth of what they experience emotionally onto the page. And I think it's a matter of trying to get that right while at the same time making things up, which I feel like it's a balancing act in a way that takes a lot of drafts to try to get right.
No, thank you for that, and yeah, thank all of you for that response. I think we actually just hit our hour, which I don't want to be true, but I believe it is. So I do just want to thank you all once again for your work, because you all have such amazing work, and I love everything I've read of y'all's, and for sharing your presence with us and with me, who I feel like I learned a lot, and kind of just, as much as I enjoy the virtual world, I would love to be able to like grab a drink with you all right now and probably still pester you with more questions. So thank you all so much. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. 2022, Chris, hopefully we'll all be together at Words and Music in New Orleans, and we can all hug and have drinks, and it will be beautiful. Until then, we are in the virtual world, but one of the beauties of the virtual world is bringing people together from lots of different places. So I think right now, even though you don't live here, Christopher, or you do live here, you're somewhere else, Chris. I know Brenda Marie's in Rhode Island, Eric's in DC, and I believe Liz is here. So that is the beauty of the virtual world, which will, I think, translate really well into the next panel, which is a conversation about the history of a particular song that we in New Orleans all love deeply in our bones. We can't sit still when it plays. It's Casanova by Levert, mostly played by brass bands here. And we're really excited because, among other people, Keith Frazier of the Rebirth Brass Band and Mark Gordon, who is the only surviving member of Levert, will be at the panel at 2:30. So please come back in 28 minutes. Tune in for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. We'll see you